Hey there, you agile pack of wild feral dogs roaming our cities, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bites, the podcast put on by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. Listeners, I have to talk to you about something today. It's going to be a little uncomfortable, but your family and your friends and I have all been talking about this, and we think it's high time that we talk to you about it in a very direct manner. I need to talk to you about your release cycle. Specifically, how often are you releasing and how traumatic is it when you do it? The thing about release cycles that I find, even with a lot of organizations that might otherwise be fairly agile in terms of what they're working on and getting that work done, a lot of times still have release cycles that probably belong in the 90s or something like that. You know, you have these larger institutions and they will release once every 6 months or once a quarter or even once a month. But release cycles are useful because in some ways they are a concrete indicator of how agile you really are. Ultimately, agility is about figuring out the right things, being responsive to things like customer needs, changing market conditions, and that sort of thing. What's our ability to adjust quickly and be delivering the right things, the valuable things, as quickly as we can do that in the midst of new requirements and changing conditions. That's really what agility is all about. And how frequently you release is one of the things that indicates how well you are actually accomplishing this feat, because ultimately, at the end of the day, nothing really matters until you get software into the hands of your users. So let me ask you for a minute to reflect on your release cycle. How often do you release? And when you do, how traumatic is it? How big of a deal are your releases? Is it something that takes hours? Does it take a large team of people? If something goes wrong, does that involve a painful rollback? I know of plenty of software development teams where their release is going to take half a day, or they can't release during the normal workday, so it takes them all night or sometimes even all weekend if things are particularly volatile. You know, there are problems with the release or bugs that they release into production and that sort of thing. So what I would like for you to do is to take the small batch principle that we apply virtually everywhere else in Agile and start applying it to your releases. I'm going to try to convince you that it's much, much better for your mental health as well as your agility if you start moving to small, frequent releases as opposed to large, infrequent releases. Now, right now, some of you might be thinking about your release process and what releases are like and how painful that whole thing is. And you're thinking, oh gosh, I can't imagine doing that more often. You know, I can't imagine that big dog and pony show happening once a week, right? Or twice a month or something like that. But I would argue that probably a lot of the pain that exists in your current release process has to do with the big batch infrequent nature of it. And if we can start migrating our release processes into small batch, higher frequency, then a lot of those pain points go away. But before I start talking about that and the challenges, I want to take a moment to talk about the benefits of applying small batches to your release. Well, obviously, the smaller your release is, the more frequently it can be done. A lot of times with big releases, you sort of wind up with these coordination issues. If it's just one team, then maybe there's a user story or two that is not quite done yet. And so then you have to make the decision, do we release on the release date? Do we push it out a few days so we can get these extra things in? Do we not release until all this content is ready to go? But if we have small releases where we're only releasing a handful of things at a time, then we can easily do that more frequently. And when we make those releases, the risk of those releases is far lower because we're only releasing a couple of things. We're not releasing 32 new features or this huge list of user stories that have built up over the month or over the quarter. Instead, we just might be releasing what we got done that week or what we got done by the end of the day. And so it's going to be small changes, small increments of progress, and the risk is going to be much lower because you're only really changing one small thing at a time. It also enables us to get value to our customers sooner, as well as shorten the feedback cycle. Hey, let's say hypothetically we're releasing every single week. Well, when that happens, our customers are getting working software. They're getting value every single week as opposed to every single month or every single quarter. And we are hearing back from them or hearing back from the market every single week as opposed to every single month or every single quarter. And this is really the heartbeat of what makes Agile efforts successful. Are our feedback loops quick? Are they responsive? And are we able to get value in front of people more frequently? And if we're doing those things, we're winning. And a big component of that is the technical component of how we do releases and making them more frequent. Another thing is if we do have to roll back, let's say we do release something, and even with the lower risk, even with the lower number of changes, it's what we're releasing is a catastrophe and we have to roll it back. Well, now we're only rolling back one thing or two things, right? The release doesn't include all the functionality we've been working on, for the month or the quarter or something like that. It's just whatever we got done this week or that day. So rolling back is just not a big consequential thing. We're also not interfering with a lot of other things when we do rollbacks that are small batches. But ultimately, all these things that I'm talking about sort of combine to create a certain cultural shift in your organization. It's a shift toward delivery. I called this episode Just Ship It because the sort of traditional way of thinking about software and doing software right is that we spend a lot of time up front making sure that the requirements are exactly correct, the plan is exactly correct, and then we execute on them. But Agile software development is a different animal. Agile software development assumes we can't get it right up front, or at least it's highly unlikely we're going to get it right up front. So instead of spending a monumental amount of time trying to get everything perfect before we start building, instead, we find out what counts as right by getting things in front of people. We get stuff in front of them, they give us feedback, and this loop is how we learn our way into the right product. It's how we discover our way into innovation and value and satisfying the needs that our users and customers actually have, as opposed to trying to get everybody to figure all that out before anyone has even looked at a screen. We all know that once users start interacting with the product, or at the very least seeing the screens they're going to be interacting with, then they think of things. Then requirements that didn't come out in the beginning all of a sudden start to come out. New stories about things they need to get done come out. Modifications begin to come out. Oh, I wish, this group of buttons were behind a panel or something like that. You start hearing those things and you start getting closer to right. Around integrity, I usually tell our teams the real requirements don't come out until the demo, because once people see something and interact with it, then that's when they start interacting with the concrete realities in front of them, and they're more capable of thinking of and articulating things like business rules or more intuitive UX or all kinds of things that is very hard to think of in the abstract when you just have a Word document open and you're typing, having a discussion before anyone has seen everything. So you begin to shift further toward that culture of delivery. Let's get stuff out the door. That doesn't mean we cut corners. It doesn't mean we ignore quality. It doesn't mean we don't do any planning up front or any kind of discovery or discussion up front. Of course, we do those things. But it just means that now we've oriented our culture to delivery, to shipping. Instead of trying to make everything perfect up front, let's get it in front of somebody and listen to what they tell us. And the more you can move your organization to that dynamic, not only the more agile will you become, but the better your products are going to be, because they are evolutionary. They adapt based on what your users are telling you. Doing small batch releases is a big part of that cultural shift. So you might be thinking, well, Phil, okay, that all sounds good, but you don't understand. Our releases take forever. They take a whole half day or a whole weekend or something like that. Well, the first thing I would have to say about that is, obviously, if you're releasing smaller batches, that should shorten release times in general, right? You are only releasing a handful of stories or features. You're not releasing this huge catalog of functionality that normally goes with big batch releases. So that should shorten things up. But the other thing I would throw out there is, if your releases are painful, then the way to remedy that is to do it more often. And I know that might sound counterintuitive because typically, if something in our lives is painful, we instinctively want to do less of it. We put our hand on the stove as a child and then it's like, well, I'm never doing that again. Or, we go to the gym and we're like, well, that sucks, so I'm not going back. But especially when it comes to release cycles, if they're painful, the way to alleviate the pain is to do them more often, because once you do, two things happen. First of all, you start getting better at releases. One of the reasons that releases do take so long is because we do them so infrequently that we don't have a nice, smooth routine set up. It's almost like we're having to recreate our release process every single time we do it when it's infrequent. And people forget things because we just don't do it often enough. But as you do it more often, you will become more practiced at it and it will get faster and it will get less painful. But the other thing that happens is when you're confronted with that pain on a regular basis, now it is a high priority to optimize that process. When that process only happens 4 times a year, organizations are very reluctant to spend the time and money necessary to make it better, because it's very easy just to sink that cost into an infrequent occurrence. If you only release 4 times a year and that release takes 2 days and everyone hates it, who cares? It's only 4 times a year. Who's going to invest in a CD pipeline? Who's going to hire somebody to come in and help you get a more automated deployments? Who's going to invest in automated testing when the only times you feel that pain point are 4 times a year? Well, if you feel that pain point every Friday, well, the pain is going to be less intense, but it's also going to be on your radar all the time. And now it's a lot easier to justify that time. It's a lot easier to justify that expense. People are going to want to optimize it. You're going to be talking about it in your retrospectives. You're going to be actively looking for both technical and practice-oriented solutions that will make your release process a lot more streamlined, because that pain is a constant as opposed to something you only experience on rare occasions. Also, obviously, a lot of the pain from a release process doesn't come from the release itself. It comes from the things that go wrong. And if you are releasing smaller and smaller batches more frequently, not only are you less likely to get something wrong, but if you do get something wrong and you have to do a rollback or one of those things that is very painful in the course of a release, well, you're only rolling back a very small chunk of things. So everything just gets easier with the more frequent releases. Now, some of you may work in environments where regulatory compliance is something you have to worry about. And you might be thinking about your very detailed release process with all these people involved and all these sign-offs, and this group can move it to staging, but they can't move it to production, and this group is the only group that can move it to production, and if something goes wrong, the developer has to fix it, but they can't actually deploy it to production. That has to be somebody else. And then we have these audit trails and we have these committees. I remember very early on in my consulting career going to an organization, and the very first meeting we had is they put up on their screen their release process, and it looked like a game board for Chutes and Ladders or Candyland. It was this long, winding road that took up the whole screen with all these different stop points along the way. And they're like, how would you optimize this? I just remember all their executives staring down the table at me, waiting for me to take this enormous mammoth thing and work the kinks out, I suppose. And I'm not trying to say that regulatory compliance isn't a thing. It is. And it will slow you down, right? And you have to pay attention to it. If you're a financial institution, a lot of you have Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. If you are developing technology for healthcare, you may have various things around HIPAA and other kinds of compliance regulations that you have to deal with. So they're going to be a thing, and they are going to slow you down more than a team that doesn't have to deal with those things. However, these things are not reasons to throw your hands up and say, well, I guess releases are just going to be infrequent and painful. Generally speaking, regulatory compliance is about complying to certain requirements, but not how you go about meeting those requirements. Okay? There's nothing in Sarbanes-Oxley that tells you you have to have 5 different committees with checkpoint phase gates throughout your deployment process. It does have requirements for how deployment is done and what parties can and can't do it, but it doesn't tell you how to go about meeting these requirements. So one of the things we have to look at is, have we built a very heavy release process to avoid running afoul of regulatory compliance, but it's much heavier than it needs to be. The regulations didn't tell us to do it this way. We just kind of piled on and piled on and piled on just to make sure we don't violate any regulations. Well, we might have a lot of unnecessary cruft in that process, and we can remove some of it and still maintain our regulatory compliance. The other thing I would throw out is the more you move your deployment process to something that is automated, you actually have an easier time with regulatory compliance, because there is no better audit trail than an automated pipeline that can take a unit of code and trace its pathway all the way from a developer's machine into production. We know where it came from. We know who committed it. We know what time it got into the various server environments. We know what time it got into production. And if you have manual checkpoints along the way, they're very easy to set up. And we know who signed off for that package moving from one environment to the other. Rollbacks become so much easier the more automated your deployment process is. So when you're thinking about things like permissions in the deployment process and roles in the deployment process, when you're thinking about things like passing audits, and when you're thinking about your ability to respond to disaster, the more automated and streamlined you can make that deployment process, actually the better you're going to be. So I would argue that if you're really concerned about regulatory compliance, instead of making it a policy-heavy process, make it an automation-heavy process. And that will get you where you need to go with a lot of regulatory compliance issues. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, but if we're releasing more frequently, if we're releasing faster, don't we run the risk of getting bugs into production because we're so afraid of getting an incomplete feature or getting bugs into production? I mean, the first thing I would say is, from a lot of organizations that I work with, I'm not sure you're as afraid of this as you say you are. Maybe we should all be a little more afraid of this, right? And instead of just taking it for granted. But if we are worried about that, again, small, more frequent releases are the remedy. The remedy isn't to take more time prior to a release. The remedy is to increase your speed of recovery. Obviously, the smaller and more frequently we're releasing, like I've said before, the lower the risk is that we're going to introduce something defective into production. Also, our automated pipelines obviously can run our automated suites of tests, and it becomes an encouragement if you're a team that doesn't have a lot of automated tests. Now, if the other reasons haven't been convincing, now you've got one, right? Create that battery of tests that your automated pipeline can run and secure yourself against bugs. If you get a bug into production, write a test around it. That bug will never happen again. It won't be able to move through the pipeline. But the other thing I would throw out there is, if you can get a unit of code from a developer's machine into production in 15 minutes, how risky is the defect issue exactly? If we put something out into production and it's an incomplete feature, or there's a bug, or it's just the wrong thing, and I can get a fix from my machine into production in 15 minutes, how worried are we then about our releases if we can recover so quickly? And like I've said before in other podcasts, and I think this is true in software development, I think it's true in agility, I think it's true in human relationships. If you try to optimize for never making a mistake, you're going to end up pretty disappointed and you're going to end up pretty stressed out because you will make mistakes. But if you optimize for your speed of recovery, then you're going to have a much healthier life cycle, right? I can't optimize mistakes out of my life, but I can be someone who can quickly fix things, who can quickly make things right, who can quickly recover from a mistake. And if you have that level of resilience into your release cycle, all of a sudden, you're not quite as afraid. Now, all of a sudden, you don't have to worry about, let's spend a hardening sprint to make sure we've gotten all the bugs out of this deployment or whatever. All of a sudden, it's not stressful, because even though we want to do everything we can to keep bugs from getting into production, we want that to be a rarity and not a common occurrence, still, we're not quite as worried about the consequences if that happens, because if you can do small, frequent, and especially fully automated releases, you can just deploy fixes very quickly. Gone are those long weekends. Gone are those 48-hour straight releases. Gone are those heroic moments where someone is up till 3 a.m. doing the release. Let's not build a heroic culture out of that. Let's think of that as a red flag. Let's start moving towards smaller batches with our releases. Small releases more frequently. You'll be getting value into the hands of your customer faster. You will be getting the feedback you need to build the right software faster, and you will be lowering the risk of your releases like crazy. So think of this as a technical and cultural aspect to your agility and a big indicator of how agile you can actually be, because in the end, it all comes down to your ability to deliver. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.